Okay, so we come to our last thinker, Michel Foucault. Um, Kant was a modern thinker, and Foucault is considered a postmodern thinker. And you should be able to distinguish already some differences. Kant is very optimistic, emphatic. Foucault's not so much pessimistic as he is skeptical. He certainly is in dialogue or in question with most all the modern premises. For Kant, the best life for the human being means to be free, rational, and moral, and especially those in combination create for the best society. So the best political state is one that allows for the most freedom, greater morality, and more thought. Um, uh, Foucault puts this to question. He questions the freeness of people. He questions the epistemological framework of rationality and questions morality also as well. Um, he calls himself in many places in different interviews a Nietzschean philosopher, and that is very appropriate. We didn't read Nietzsche, but it is important to realize the influence of Nietzsche on um, Foucault. Nietzsche already questions Kant's morals, freedom, and rationality. It's all in Nietzsche as well. Hence, Nietzsche's usually considered the father of postmodernity. Um, anyway, there's two sources I think that are especially influential to Foucault. The first, as I said, was Nietzsche, and then the other is Karl Marx. Karl Marx might be the most important 20th century philosopher for various reasons, because his work affected not only fields like theory of economy or political economy, but also theory of history, critical theory, sociology, psychology, all these different fields. Unfortunately, we're so indoctrinated in the United States not to read Marx that we don't really understand the importance of his thought, whether or not maybe a person is a communist or socialist or whatever. Um, but some of the fundamental tenets that are important that I think you'll see for Marx and Foucault is he questions how ideology works in relation to class. So you have, say, the working class person, and then you say, what uh, Marx calls the bourgeois, the bourgeoisie class, those who own the means of production, and so forth. And how he says that those who own the means of production also own the means of mental production. That is, even though they're the minority group, their ideas are actually more disseminated, more well known, and have a kind of power or dominance. Which is funny since you would consider the majority to have that, and Marx says no. And part of the reason, of course, is that those who have more money have more means of disseminating their ideas than those who don't. So money and power and the economic uh, strings that hide all, or tie all that together are very important. Um, and so Foucault takes quite a bit from this. If indeed it is true that certain groups, not necessarily always the bourgeoisie, but any certain group has ability of influence to disseminate their ideas more broadly, especially after the printing press and so forth. You can think of academics and other people like that. Then it's important to see how those groups are able to shape thought, idea within a society as a whole, whether that's French society, English society, American society, and so forth. Um, and then, unlike Kant's optimism, that once we had people who were generally literate, then when people read and compared ideas, they would pick the better idea. They would pick the idea that would mean more freedom of thought, more freedom of person, more freedom of economy, and so forth. But what if, in fact, it could be otherwise, or even the opposite, that greater and greater oppression takes place through knowledge or ideological means. Um, and so this becomes very important to Foucault. Foucault especially begins a lot of his work through historical analysis, and he considers those groups that would be outside of the Enlightenment paradigm. So he considers, first of all, those who were considered insane or mad, and how they were treated, and how various systems of knowledge and power intertwined to deal with the people who were institutionalized for being insane. For also looking at the penal system, the criminal system, which acts were considered criminal, why, how are people treated or considered, what is the place of the subject, kind of as an object within the prison or criminal system. Um, he also liked to look at early religious thought in the Middle Ages, sort of the idea of the priest as the person who listens to confession and advises, and also how this overlaps into psychology and psychiatry. You go to psychiatrists, they listen, and so forth. Interesting kind of stuff. But the different groups that are marginalized, um, uh, there's a lot of feminist theory that comes out of Foucault. He doesn't deal with it a lot, but especially there is this underlying notion within the Victorian era, especially about the family, um, the relation of husband to wife, the relation of father to daughter, the relation of mother to son, to mother to daughter, and so forth, and how there's these kind of subtle relations of power, and how, interestingly, ideological frameworks can take hold within those who are oppressed. So that, interestingly enough, uh, it could be the mother who is the most emphatic about the so-called female role that the daughter should take up, rather than the father or the teacher or some other role model. And this is very interesting, how people who are oppressed can take on the ideology of the oppressor, um, and actually become more fanatical about it, which is rather interesting. Um, so anyway, as a historian, he just wanted to delineate how uh, power relations work, especially not for those who work within a democratic society like Kant wanted to think about, but those who are basically outside. Um, for Kant, for you to be a part of society, or for you to be a free moral agent, you had to have rationality first, um, and uh, the problem with people who are considered mad in his book Madness and Civilization is that they're outside of that paradigm, right? So then, why or what constitutes the notion of someone being irrational, insane? And this can be very frightening if you actually read some of the history, especially if you read a lot of the history in feminist thought, how women could be institutionalized by their husbands or so forth, just for being called hysterical, for not having the same kind of sex appetites as their husbands, disturbing things that you can read about, and unfortunately there's a mass amount of it. Women institutionalized for being irrational, insane. Uh, that now, if we looked at it, we would either laugh or be frightened about, because it's absurd. But anyway, to try to understand the epistemological line that psychiatrists and sociologists and psychologists sort of wrote about and talked about, in order to decide who is sane and who is insane. Um, Another thing that he's very interested in is in sexuality. How does it become, of course, that the people who are bisexual or homosexual or so forth are considered to be adverse? They're outside the paradigm. Uh, they need to be cured. I mean, and then this is not like a religious idea. I mean, Freud had this idea that people who are gay needed to be cured, and psychoanalysis would help with this, and so forth. Um, and so, and again, you could be institutionalized for these things. I mean, look at Oscar Wilde and other very famous people, for example, who were put in prison just for the suspicion, essentially, of being homosexual. And so That's another paradigm that gets looked at. Sexuality, whether you're sort of within the Enlightenment picture of being part of politics or whether you should be excluded from it. That is, do you have real freedom or not because of certain institutional ideas? Again, the prison system, it's very interesting to think about incarceration. Um, some things are sort of obvious. You commit murder, you steal, some of these types of things, you're incarcerated. But if you look at the history of this, people are incarcerated for all kinds of other things that would very much scare you, especially if you went back and read, into the, 16th century, the 17th century, and so forth. It's very interesting. But um, uh, what Foucault finds interesting is this sort of marginalization of different groups for, I think, probably what he considers sort of arbitrary notions of epistemological frame, that for some reason somebody's not within the Enlightenment epistemological frame, and therefore could be institutionalized, or could be a lawbreaker, could be considered insane, and so forth. Um, Especially for Foucault, why? So as you do the reading, you definitely see that Foucault, he doesn't really like to take a position himself. What he likes to do is analysis of various frameworks and ask various questions. He's not a philosopher who's trying to propound specific conclusions. He's more trying to question the conclusions that were already um, came to, and most of those are Enlightenment or modern conclusions. And hence you have post-modernity. Post-modernity is often considered this, you know, annoying philosophical school because, it just questions all these different things and it doesn't have an answer or whatever. Often is how it's considered. But it is important that there are conclusions that can be drawn just by putting a question mark in front of certain moderns or Enlightenment's pictures of human nature. And I think you'll see that coming out from doing the reading. I would especially put a lot of attention when you do the reading on the introduction, especially that early part where there's discussion of Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault's debate that they had on international television, and you can watch it on YouTube or whatever you want. It's a very interesting debate because Noam Chomsky is definitely still a proponent of the very typical view of Enlightenment, close to Kant's. I wouldn't say it's absolute at all, but very close. He very much considers that the problems of oppression can be dealt with by analysis, by reason, and by considering what a free society would look like. And he very much thinks that people can see the difference when they look at two different paradigms. Human beings have the ability to realize one is a better picture than the other. And he very much believes that human beings are innately thoughtful, in Kant's terms, rational, and creative, and that we desire a creative and free society. That's a very wonderful thing about Noam Chomsky or whatever. Foucault is not so optimistic. He's concerned about how society modifies and shapes people in what he calls power relations, many which are extremely subtle, ones that we don't even understand ourselves. And although I think in many ways they agree on a lot of the conclusions, they don't have the same epistemological framework for doing so. Foucault is pretty clear that he doesn't really think that there is such a thing as human nature, and he's quite clear that he doesn't think that history is leading towards some end that's obvious, and that each year we sort of get better, as Kant has, and I think at least Noam Chomsky certainly hopes for, although I don't think he's as optimistic as Kant, especially in the piece that you just recently read. But this makes Foucault very interesting because everyone so far has had a pretty definite human nature picture. Foucault does not have one. He's concerned with sort of going back to the drawing board. He calls it the problematizations of human nature. He wants to relook at the problems. Why did they become problems? How are they dealt with? What are the different discourses on them, and so forth, and compare and contrast them. Um, so he's an interesting thinker because he is agnostic about there being a such a thing as human nature, but certainly at the same time, uh, you can't do this from absolutely nowhere. You have to start from somewhere, and there has to be certain shared things that he views that people have. I mean, for example, he's doing analysis. If he didn't have certain quote unquote rational abilities, he wouldn't be able to do analysis at all. He wouldn't be able to look at history and look at innumerable texts and then form a kind of synthesis of what he thinks is taking place historically. Um, but unlike Hegel and Kant, especially, but like Friedrich Nietzsche, he sees history as not going somewhere fundamentally, but being more about relations of power. Um, he sees his project as being genealogical. Nietzsche wrote a famous book which is called The Genealogy of Morals. And in it, instead of positing that one moral system following after another is rather a better system, which both Kant and Hegel believed, Nietzsche, and Foucault pretty much follows with this, is to just simply consider why one morality followed another historically. That is, what happens when one group gets greater power or the ability to disseminate their ideas faster through, say, maybe a new technology like the printing press or something like that, than the group before. So looking at it as groups of power trying to persuade people of new, Foucault calls them techniques of the self and different things like that, different ways to consider yourself as an individual or within a society, and to compare and contrast those groups rather than assume that there's a sort of rational ladder whereby when people look at two different paradigms, they'll always pick the better one because they can understand that one is better than the other. Foucault puts a big question mark next to that. Is it actually true that we pick the one that's better? Is there even such a thing sort of as better, or is there just a sort of multiplicity? And again, I want to emphasize with Foucault that um, power for him is power relations. So it's not something simple, and this is why in many ways he disagreed with a lot of the Marxist thinkers at the time of at least the 60s and the 70s, was that they definitely looked at things as class antagonism, one group over or against another. If you read Marx himself, he's much more sophisticated than this, and a good Marxist is anyway. But the thing about most Marxists is they're concerned about money and the means of production. They're not concerned about all these little ideological things. Anyway, um, his point of view is that power is not one group trying to oppress another. That may take place, but that's only one of the most blunt, sort of obvious instruments of power. Most power is much more subtle, especially when you think about knowledge. And that often, interestingly enough, the group that disseminates the idea is the most indoctrinated. And there's a sense in which a person can be a total ideologue to a view and not really even understand what that view is doing to them or how it may be indeed oppressing them. But they believe it more emphatically than many other people within the system or group, even though they're the most oppressed. And this is the sort of irony that you have that has to be considered for Foucault. His power is not one group who, with knowledge, is like, okay, I'm gonna, indoctrinate and use propaganda and manipulate this other group. But in fact, it's much more subtle than that. And the people themselves who do the indoctrination and set up the propaganda and so forth are often blind to most of the ways in which that kind of knowledge actually encompasses them. And often is exploitive directly to them. And so he doesn't want it to be sort of a kind of dyad of, black and white and good versus evil and, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Instead, he wants us to see that the relations of power are subtle, and that um, often it's not about appropriation of somebody's goods or whatever. Sometimes there's the addition of goods, but with a caveat that it's not always about, say, removing pleasure, but often about giving some sort of pleasure um, and so forth within a power relationship. And so it's not yes or no. It's not these sort of obvious things. And you'll see this in the reading some of it, coming out. Um, his concern is that we've thought in two diametric terms about power, and what we need to start understanding is that it's very subtle. It doesn't work the way that you usually consider it in past models. And knowledge is very important in this, and especially now, I would say Foucault's work becomes very interesting when you think about big data and so forth. That all this knowledge that is being collected has a use, and it's being used in various ways in which the people who use it don't even always understand what the outcome is. But it is changing the ideological framework of societies and economies without us really realizing it until maybe many years after. Um, so knowledge has this kind of bifurcation aspect. In one way, we use it and we think that we know what we're using it for, and the other is that out of that, some other thing is actually occurring that we don't perceive, maybe never perceive, or perceive much later when we look back, which is, of course, the job of the historian, somebody who looks back, does analysis, and then looks at other aspects instead of sort of the obvious aspects. Um, and so his critique of Kant and modernity and various thinkers in that tradition is that they tend to emphasize again and again the things that they have a sort of enlightenment optimism about science, human freedom, democratic politics, mathematics and rationality, morality, especially as a categorical imperative rather than the way morality is given to us, say, in the Greeks. In fact, they don't even have the notion of morality, they have ethos. Um, and so he wants to question these things, especially in relation to the so-called human sciences. Foucault is not, he's not skeptical of what technology can do in terms of science and bioscience and these various things like that. What he is concerned about is the so-called human sciences, and especially psychology, psychiatry, sociology, economics, politics. These are all social sciences. They have to do with how we live. And our ideas about them do affect what happens in our lives. And if we don't consider them, then we are sort of just victims of our own sort of bad conceptions of the real or the truthful about the world, politics, and ourselves. Um, and especially if you belong to one of those marginalized groups. If you're a woman, if you're gay, if you're um, someone with mental illness, all these different things, it's going to definitely affect you in a much more profound way, because society has made frameworks and social rules and laws that exclude some people and reward others according to a certain kind of epistemological framework. Um, Now, does that ultimately undermine Kant? I mean, someone like Noam Chomsky again? I mean, absolutely not in his view. But what I want you to just to think about is more whether you can consider yourself more on the side of, say, Kant, who you just read, or Foucault, modern or postmodern, in some of these views or perspectives. As the world gets more complicated, as we have the expanse of global economies, of global politics, trying to think about international law, all these very difficult problems that are intercultural, involve all kinds of different people, different points of view, religions, ideologies, and so forth. Is it true that Kant or Noam Chomsky is right that we all have something fundamentally the same that we can use to resolve those differences? Or do we need to be more careful about the subtleties and not have the optimism where we think that we're all doing the right thing, that we're all on the same side. In fact, we're exploiting mass groups of people simply because they're slightly different than us, or they don't fit within the framework of what we want to call rational, a free agent, and therefore moral, and therefore part of the moral agent community. And you'll study this more when you get into ethics, which will be great. But now's a great point to just look at the question of human nature and whether or not you think, especially that this rational calculative ability can give us the kind of answers we need, especially about the human sciences. And this is a very interesting question because the human sciences very much do affect us. But they are not like doing chemistry or doing medicine, or creating better technologies. These are about how we live, how we structure communities, what laws we make about criminality or whether a person should be institutionalized because of mental illness, and these kinds of rather difficult questions. And I would say they're very fundamental questions now. I mean, if you look at the statistics of, for example, mental illness in the United States and so forth, greatly on the rise. So there's more and more people that will have to consider about what is the answer for people like this. What kind of freedoms would be wise for us to take away because they might harm themselves, or what kind of freedoms are we taking away that are simply just exploitive and we don't really understand that we're simply harming them because our ideological framework is that they should be like us in some way or whatever. So these are hard questions and they belong to the human sciences, but ultimately they go back to the problems of philosophy and epistemology, which is about what human beings are capable of knowing. What do people have to be capable of knowing in order to act in a certain way, right? If certain people cannot perform certain functions, it still would be true that we can't consider them to be moral agents, and they may be harmful to other people. They may, actually, because of their mental illness, try to harm people, things like that. So we do need to know about these things. But we need to be cautious, especially when we look at history and we look at the different pitfalls that, especially psychiatry and so forth, has fallen into in how it's treated people according to their frameworks and so forth. So anyway, yeah, as you're doing the reading, I definitely want you to consider this juxtaposition between the modern and the postmodern that we see between Foucault and Kant, and generally get a sort of bigger picture, I think, maybe about your own view about history. Like basically, where are we all going? Are we going somewhere? And does it seem to be true that we are? Or is there no real indication that we're going anywhere? Has science genuinely been like a good thing for humanity? Or when we look at it, especially in the quote unquote age of the Anthropocene with all of our ecological environmental issues, was it rather foolish for us to be so optimistic to, we just thought, oh, yeah, we can do something, so let's do it. And we didn't ask what the overall repercussions of it would be. We didn't really ask whether we should do it. Is it good for human beings? In relation to the question of what are we, what are our needs, what makes us happy, but instead just I can build this. It'd be interesting to do this. I'll do it. And we're getting to an even more important, I think, moment now with the mapping of the genome and so forth, and with new technologies in general, AI and so forth, that we need to very much think about the repercussions of, just as we didn't really think about the repercussions of the Industrial Revolution or the quote-unquote space age. We're in a new age that will have repercussions for the human sciences, for how we live together as communities, how we communicate, whether we incarcerate people, who is marginalized by an economy, or who gets, the brunt of the wealth from that kind of economy, and all these rather difficult questions. So I really want you to think about those things when you read Foucault and so forth. This is sort of our last stop, our last place to consider humanity in the bigger picture, especially. And it's interesting. I like to do Foucault at the end because Foucault, at the end of his life, he gives these lectures in Paris, and they've been published now. One is called The Courage of Truth, and the other is called The Hermeneutic of the Subject. And in it, he goes back to the Stoics and the Cynics and some of Platonism, which is kind of interesting. And he starts thinking about care of the self, which is really interesting. So we kind of go full circle, which I like. Since he's not at all satisfied with the modern picture of morality and so forth, he goes back to the Greeks, and he goes back to these various techne of the self and notions of care of the self. And at a certain point in his life, he actually thought about taking on these different practices, especially Stoic practices. He told one of his friends and so forth. He never actually ended up doing it, unfortunately. He died in 1984 of AIDS. He would still be alive probably today, except for that. At that time, they had almost no way of impeding AIDS or slowing it down or whatever. And so after he contracted it, he died fairly rapidly, which is tragic. But he was somebody who went back to these practices of the ancients, and he wanted to problematize them as sorry as possible ways of rethinking the self, and also considering new ways of protest and looking at politics from the point of view of people who are marginalized. He was definitely a political activist and was involved in those kind of things. And he liked especially the Cynics and so forth because they were such a marginalized group, and yet they had a kind of form of protest in their form of life. And he was very interested in Stoic practices and all these other various theories. So at the end of his life, he very much goes back to the ancients and to the Greeks and to the idea of ethos. And he wanted to consider more and more how they looked at techne of the self and how they looked at care of the self, and sort of try to reformulate that historical notion in a new way that would fit in the 20th century and so forth. So it's fun, to consider a philosopher who's both very much steeped in the modern and postmodern, but had a love for the ancients and a real respect for them, and went back to them in the end. And it would have been nice to see how he ultimately would have fused some of these ideas and what he would have done with them. But you can read some of those in the interviews of his later life, and also in these later lectures that he had. But we don't get to see the culmination of them because of his early death. Anyway, so this is our last philosopher and our last reading, and I hope all of you guys are doing well and staying healthy and having some fun and having some good weather and some things like that, and in your life, and family and everybody is doing well. And happy Easter to everybody. I hope you were able in some ways to be with your family and enjoy some good times together. And it's too bad. I miss you guys. I wish that we would have been able to have discussions, especially about Kant and Foucault, because I think there's so many fun contemporary questions to ask that I would love to have heard your thoughts and views on. And I am very much enjoying reading your essays, and I get a lot from you there. But it would have been nice to have class discussion. But here we are. This is a good time to do our Stoic practices and realize what's in our control and what's not in our control. Anyway, I hope you're all doing well and prospering and good health, and happy Easter to all. And enjoy Foucault, and take care of yourself.